I'm Liz Neisloss. Tonight on Greater Boston, Harvard University is caught in the middle of a controversy after more than 30 student groups blamed the Israeli government for the brutal attacks by Hamas. Similar statements have emerged on other campuses, and some individuals behind them are being threatened. I'll speak with 3 professors about what's unfolding and how it should be managed. Plus, the Green Line extension is back up to normal speed as some slow zones fade away. I'll speak with the new appointee to the MBTA Board of Directors about the road ahead. As the fighting between Israel and Hamas escalates after the militant group's bloody attack in which they killed scores of Israeli civilians and took many hostages, politicians, public figures, and activists here in the U.S. have clashed over how to respond. And in some cases, the debate is getting ugly, particularly on college campuses. At Harvard, a letter written by the Undergraduate Palestinian Solidarity Committee drew heated condemnation for blaming the attacks on Israel's occupation of Palestine, saying this, quote, did not occur in a vacuum. Since the letter was released, critics have called for students who signed the letter to be doxed, expelled, and blacklisted from future employment. In response, Harvard President Claudine Gay distanced the school from the letter, insisting the students behind it did not represent the university or its leadership. Was that the right move? Is this the opportunity to foster new dialogue about this contentious issue, even as the death tolls climb? To discuss, I am joined by Boaz Barak, a Harvard professor of computer science who criticized the student statement in a letter signed by 350 other faculty members, Tufts political science professor Malik Mufti, who focuses on international relations and the Middle East, and Kenneth Stern, the director of the Bard Center for Hate and the author of The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israeli-Palestine campus debate. Professor Barak, can we start with you? I may have very briefly distilled your position, but can you explain your reaction to the Harvard student statement?
So the Harvard student statement came out while hostages were still being released, and they were still actively trying to release them. And if you think about the reaction of Jewish and Israeli students at Harvard, while they are worried about their relatives, some of them have friends that attended the very same music festival, and they are seeing a letter that blames Israel for the attack of Hamas. Now, the conflict itself is complicated and has a very large context. But there are some cases where some events you just have to see where something is simply beyond the pale, and some, terrorism should never be justified. And I should say that I do not join any calls to dox or punish the individual students. What I oppose is the statement and not the students.
Okay, Professor Mufti, I want to ask you, because we didn't state what your position was. Did you have a position on this statement?
Look, the conflict in Palestine isn't a conflict between democracy and a terrorist organization, or between good and evil. It's an ethnic territorial conflict in which one side is occupying the other, and where inevitably there's going to be atrocities committed by both sides, and the cruelest, hardest men rise to the top on both sides. So these statements that we've had at Tufts and at Harvard and in other universities, I don't believe that they are celebrating the killing of innocent civilians, of children. You'd have to be psychopathic to derive any pleasure from that. I think what they're supporting is the right of resistance, right, against an occupying enemy. Just as I don't believe that the Israeli people who take part in pro-Israel rallies are celebrating the killing of Palestinian children or civilians, but simply supporting retaliation. So I think it's very hard to try to talk about these issues without bringing in the broader context.
Well, I do have to ask you, Professor Mufti, there was a statement which came from a group at Tufts which actually celebrated the creativity of Hamas. So it seems to have gotten even uglier. Professor Stern, this is clearly not just contained to Harvard, and this is not just contained to this issue, but you have focused specifically on the Israel-Palestine debate. What do you think is unfolding right now? What are you seeing unfolding across campuses?
Well, first of all, it's not every campus. There's some campuses where this is a particular issue, and the ones you mentioned are among them. I think students feel very strongly in one way or another for one nationality or another, one narrative or another. And that's okay for them to articulate that. What's not okay is when there's, threats and intimidation and bullying and so forth. And that's the role of the administration to make sure that students have a right to say even things that others might find offensive, to recognize that other students may in fact find them offensive, but to protect academic freedom and free speech. And, for me, I was offended by the Harvard student statements because I think not acknowledging that, when babies are beheaded, that there's something that you should at least acknowledge, and that when you're talking about a pro-Palestinian view, that seems to me to be a problem. But I'm disturbed deeply by the attempts to dox these students, to out them. There's a potential for threats against them. There are people that are saying don't hire them. These are 18, 19, 20-year-olds. You want to give them the space to express their ideas, to in fact be wrong, and to think about how they're going to think about these difficult issues for the rest of their lives. That's the purpose of the university.
Well, and even just before the taping, reportedly Columbia University in New York closed its campus. An Israeli student was beaten up there. So I don't know that we can yet say this is particularly contained. But Professor Stern, I want to ask you, universities are issuing statements and then reissuing statements. Is that a useful exercise? Is there something more that should be done at this moment?
Well, first on the Columbia situation, there's obviously a difference between an open campus in the middle of an urban center than a more rural campus, and you have to worry about people that are outside the campus. So Columbia is just making sure that it's only students that are there. I'm not a great fan of statements. I've worked on statements with college presidents over the years. They're usually best when they talk about academic freedom and free speech and the role of the university and the role of students. The outside groups seem to want to have the university leadership ratify their narrative, ratify their perspective, and that's not the role of the university. The role of the university is to acknowledge that their students obviously are distressed by this. People may have relatives on both sides of the border there that they're worried about, friends and colleagues and so forth, and then think about how do you use the campus as a way to have discussions across deep divides, not just today where it may be hard, but how do you set up that environment over time for students to realize it's okay to be disturbed when you hear somebody say something that cuts you to the core, but it's not okay to be intimidated and bullied, and to then think about classes and structures and speakers and so forth to really gravitate towards that impulse to say, how do we think about this in this 4 years we're here about difficult situations that we feel deeply about around the world.
So, Professor Mufti, are you talking with your students about what's unfolding, not as part of necessarily what your syllabus has, but are you hearing from students and others on campus? Is this a dialogue that you're having?
Well, yes. In fact, yesterday was the first time that I talked with any students about it after class. Those were Middle Eastern students, Arab students, who expressed discomfort about the doxing, about the public attacks on students who express support for the Palestinians. But I have to say, and first of all, I agree completely with what Professor Stern have just said. It's not, the whole idea of university administration is trying to appease every possible community and every possible group by issuing these kind of bland statements and then trying to shift a little bit on the other side. It's not very helpful. The role of the university is indeed to create a space where people's sympathies and standpoints are respected, but they're allowed to engage with each other, to be exposed to opposing standpoints and sympathies, to engage with them in a civil manner, to be sure. And that's our job as faculty and as administrators, to make sure that we create that kind of environment. I do have to say, Tufts has a pretty good record in that regard. Whenever we've had incidents of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, almost all the campus groups tend to come together, administration, faculty, students, and we really try to suppress that kind of atmosphere.
Professor Barak, I want to ask you, do you think that a university college statement is an important thing to get out there? Does it serve a purpose? And do you see a more productive path?
I mean, the university does not always have to make statements about everything that happens, but sometimes it is forced to do. So, you know, a university might not have to make a statement when, say, earthquakes happened in Turkey, as terrible as it was. It could, but if there was a group of students at the campus that are celebrating this earthquake, and there have been even worse things than that statement in social media, then the university might actually be forced to make a statement to make sure that students are feel that they are supported, and that it's not tolerated on this campus to celebrate the deaths of their relatives and friends. And I should say that I don't think this Hamas attack should be phrased in the form of the greater Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I actually think that Hamas does not represent Palestinians, and the people that would suffer the most if Hamas is viewed as the representative of Palestinians are the Palestinian people. So Hamas doesn't even control the West Bank, and even in Gaza, it's controlling by a brutal regime. So I don't think they should be, by supporting them or not condemning them, the people on campus, the Palestinian Solidarity Group, are basically giving them implicit approach. They implicitly are saying that Hamas represents the Palestinians, which is actually what people that oppose a Palestinian state would try to promote. So just like the ISIS does not represent all Muslims, I don't think Hamas represents all Palestinians.
So, Professor Stern, you yourself have noted that in this conflict, over the conflict, people reach for what is black and white and like to reduce everything. Is this a missed opportunity, again, to draw out what Professor Barak is pointing to?
Well, I think that's a perspective that students should hear, that to really mind the complexities of this. But you're absolutely right. There's, from the field of hate studies and the component parts, brain science and social psychology and so forth, we know that when people's identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice or injustice, their brain fires a little differently. They choose to want to see things in binary ways. And we see it on other issues too, on Republicans versus Democrats, on issues like abortion. And we try to make the world simple. We try to make justice only on our side and injustice completely the story of the other side. And we avoid looking at evidence that contradicts our a priori beliefs. And in a way, that's the greatest opportunity. Again, maybe not while everybody is seeing the news at the moment and so forth. But, over the long haul, to use cases like this to get students to really see the complexities. And what I tell them is that when you see a simple solution to a complicated problem, it's usually the wrong answer. And you have to really expand looking at what you're thinking about. You have to also have the emotional empathy to think about, gee, there's this other group of students that has this different point of view. Why are they thinking that way? How could I have the emotional empathy to put myself in their situation? I may totally disagree with them. And if I'm going to oppose them politically, don't I really have the opportunity to really understand them better if I do that? So there's a lot a university can do to mine issues like this to improve education.
Rather than just a statement. And so, Professor Mufti, some might say this is a discussion that isn't centered around the people who are directly affected. This is just it's unfolding at elite colleges and campuses. But is there something deeper at stake here?
I think there is. I mean, in recent years, we've seen a kind of polarization in our country of the kind that Professor Stern has just talked about. Conservatives have complained for some years now that campuses have become too inhospitable to their ideas. And I'm actually in sympathy with that complaint. I think it's really crucial that universities be places where, pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, conservative and liberal opinions are able to be expressed. Otherwise, the core function of the university is corrupted. And more generally, I think our democracy is threatened as well.
Do you think, Professor Barak, that college campuses have any means of grappling with the intense misinformation which flies around, which everyone consumes, but which intensifies these divides on campuses?
I think college campuses are as exposed to misinformation as any other public sphere in the US and elsewhere. But we do have the ways to promote debate, and I do think it is important to debate opposing views. And I just think that rejecting terrorism needs to be a premise in order to have a discussion. We can have a discussion about, for example, the boycott, diversion and sanction, the BDS movement, which I personally do not support and oppose, but I can respect people that support it. But I don't think we can have a discussion of, killing babies, pros and cons.
Right. And so, Professor Stern, when I talk about, are there deeper stakes here? Are we talking about, I think, fueling anti-Semitism, fueling what we're seeing, attacks on individuals, doxing, all that sort of thing? Where does this lead?
Well, I'm worried about those things, and not just on the campus. If you look historically, going back to the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, whenever there was fighting involving Israel, there was an uptick in attacks on Jews in Europe and elsewhere, and the campus was no exception. The prior Gaza conflicts tended to happen when school wasn't in session, so that was less of a concern than now. But security and the safety of students, their physical safety is a priority. But again, I think that ultimately the role of the academy is the key here, and to remember that what you're doing is trying to create another generation of students who have a respect for academic freedom, to have a respect for free speech, to have emotional empathy, to have respect for democracy and the free speech component of that particularly, and to go and defend their opponents, even if they find that what they're saying vile, when others are trying to deny them employment or to put them in harm's way.
And perhaps
that is a campus.
Right. And to learn the skill of conducting discussion debate, which is something they are there to do. We have to leave it there. Professor Boaz Barak, Malik Mufti, and Kenneth Stern, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, a rare bit of good news for the MBTA. The Green Line extension is back up and running. The trains had been forced to crawl down the tracks at 3 miles an hour or so, so-called slow zones between Union Square and Medford, which began in part a month just after the last leg of the extension officially opened. The slow zones were lifted last night, a little more than a day ahead of schedule, but there are still some in place elsewhere on the T. And the frustrations with the MBTA don't just start with the Green Line, but Boston now has a new voice on the issue of all things MBTA. Mary Skelton Roberts. Mayor Wu recently appointed Ms. Roberts to a newly created City of Boston seat on the MBTA board, and she joins me now.
Hi there, good to be here.
Thanks very much. Thank you for joining me. Mayor, yours, as I just mentioned, is a relatively new position. Explain to people the significance of this position and how you see the job.
Absolutely. So when you say new, it is really fresh. It's about 2 weeks in. And this is after many, many years of the city of Boston really advocating to have not just a seat, but more importantly, a voice on the board. And so I see this role as an opportunity to represent the city of Boston, the mayor, and the region in ensuring that as we're developing as we're fixing the T, but more importantly, planning what our transportation system is going to look like in the future, that we're prioritizing sort of our investments and our policies and what we focus on based on where the needs are the greatest. So really thinking about the nexus of what are we trying to accomplish and what do we need our public transportation system to do relative to climate, relative to our economic goals, relative to our equity goals. All of those are important considerations.
So many people may wonder, what sort of leverage do you have with this post? People who might not be that familiar with the structure of the board and the power that it has.
Yeah, so I would say it's less about leverage and more about really being able to collaborate and have some robust conversations. If as a board, we get to the place where we understand, like, what do we want this transit system to be? How do we want to really prioritize where we make our investments? And then more importantly, we have climate goals we have to accomplish. We have, like I said, economic development goals. So being able to look at the role our public transportation system needs to play vis-a-vis some of those metrics, I think those are important conversations that all of my colleagues on the board want to engage in. I'm not seeing this as a situation where it's going to be combative or adversarial. I will absolutely be advocating for Boston. I represent the mayor and I represent the constituencies of Boston, but the public transportation system is Boston and beyond. And so recognizing, what do the conversations need to look like? How are we making sure that Boston's voice is well represented and that decisions that are made on the board are also reflective of the needs of the city and the region and the state.
So I do have to ask you about something that we led with, which is something currently pressing on a lot of people's minds, which is the Green Line mess. Do you have a take on who's responsible and how that should be fixed?
Yeah, I am too new to know who's responsible or really the intricate details on the Green Line. But what I can tell you is what you started with is that they fixed it ahead of schedule, right? And so it's unfortunate that it happened. We will, I'm sure, get some more information on what caused it. But what I really want to focus on is when these issues arise, are they being dealt with well? Are they being done, are the repairs or whatever the issue is addressed rapidly? And are we able to get people back on, in this case, the Green Line, right?
So let's turn now to buses. You're a rider of the Orange Line. You're also a rider of various bus lines. There has been a lot of talk about redesigning Boston's bus lines, the MBTA bus network. It seems to be stalled at this point. There's a lot of public pushback. Where are we in that? Where do you see it?
Yeah, I think that when you were dealing with a changing climate, I mean, we've all seen the pictures of the subway in New York City flooded. We had experiences here when we had the terrible storm several years ago that our blue line was flooded. We cannot be a sustainable state. We cannot be economically competitive without thinking about how we are doing buses, because buses will do a number of things. Within the city of Boston, it will get people in and out in ways that you can't. When you're looking at some of our suburbs, where you're not going to be able to build rail, having rapid bus is a viable solution. So I think that we do want to have a conversation. What does it look like to have, to really lean into the bus redesign system that the state committed to and the city's pushing for? I'm a huge advocate of bus rapid transit. We have seen it work successfully all over the world. I mean, when I was at the Bar Foundation, I took people to multiple trips to Mexico City to see this world-class bus rapid transit system. And in 6 or 7 years, they built, 6 or 7 lines. And now the bus moves more people in Mexico City than the rail. So we have these models of really high-end, really rapid buses that move people quickly. I think people are resistant because they haven't seen that here.
So you jumped to something I was hoping to get to later, which is you talk about models in other parts of the world, things we can learn from other countries, other modes of transport. Mexico City buses are one thing you just mentioned. Are there other examples that Boston really should take?
I mean, when you look at the London transportation system, right? You have the bus schedule is integrated with the train schedule so that it looks like a seamless, it's not one mode. The way they've designed public transit, it's a seamless system. So the schedules are coordinated. When you go to places like London or Paris or even Seoul, you literally have what we call 2-minute headways, which means those trains come every 2 to 3 minutes. So there's a level of certainty and a level of consistency that people have learned to rely on, and they trust the system. That is something that is not hard to do. When we get our tracks repaired and we really start thinking about making big investments, we can do that here.
That may be the key, though, making big investments. What you're describing sounds fabulous, but also sounds like it will take some deep pockets to get it done.
We're not a broke state. So I think I want to start there. We're often saying it's going to be expensive, but when you have such ambitious climate goals like we have, when you have people that need to get to jobs, we have all these academic institutions where young people are trying to get to school. We have people needing to get to all the major hospitals. The public transportation system needs to be the core mode. We have to do it for our climate goals, for our equity goals. So rather than thinking about what it's going to cost, is what is it going to save us in terms of climate, in terms of moving people around. People are going to be, shopping more in the cities. They're going to be walking around. They're going to be doing the kinds of things that I hope will increase economic sort of opportunities and bring more dollars to local businesses.
So still on the subject of money, but much smaller scale, more immediate, there are 3 free bus routes now in Boston. I know you're a supporter of that. It's a 2-year pilot, which I believe ends in February. It was funded by COVID funds. Will that be extended? Should that be extended? And how would that be funded?
I hope that it is. I hope one of the things we learned from the free bus pilot is that when you make it free, more people ride it. And if we really are trying to get more people to ride public transit, looking at a different revenue model that's not requiring everyone or most or all people. I mean, why couldn't we make it free? I guess that's my question. If we're going to look at it, we have a robust business economy. We have different models of funding things. There's advertising. I think we may want to be more creative about who we're asking to pay for our public transit system.
And where do we stand in the process of transforming the bus system, to transforming the fleet into an electric fleet at this point?
So I know that the mayor has done, the school buses in Boston have gone electric, and I think that's a really good step in the right direction. Like I started when I said I'm too new to know all the details, so I don't know where we've moved in the electrification front, but it absolutely has to be a top priority, particularly given that we have these ambitious climate goals. We have to electrify our trains, our buses, public transit. We've got to get more EVs on the road as we're looking at, reducing our emissions. There's a lot that we need to do, but I don't know the details. And ask me again in 6 weeks and I should be able to tell you more.
Well, I don't know about 6 weeks, Mary Skelton Roberts, but we want to have you back when you really have your sleeves rolled up in this job. And there is certainly a lot more to ask. Thank you very much for joining us. That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. Thanks for watching. Good night.